Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Telecom video, we're going to be going over an interview that Eurogamer have had with 4A Games Chief Technical Officer Oles Shishkovstov. Now, several viewers have actually linked me this and asked my opinions regarding what exactly he's saying, you know, what it actually means for the next generation consoles, the Xbox One, particularly the DDR3 and ES RAM, the SDK, PC gaming, and a few other bits and pieces. So I've got a link in the video description to the article, but I'm not going to be reading out all of it because, frankly speaking, some of it is regarding the previous generation consoles. Instead, I'm going to just cherry pick the big issues that a lot of you have asked me questions on, and I'm just going to quickly go over translation of it, if you will. I'm just going to let you know what it is, or rather what it means. I will say that a lot of this stuff isn't particularly super duper new information, at least to me, and by what I mean by that is that if you've been following the development and the news of the next generation consoles really closely, and indeed I've actually put a couple of articles out which have hypothesized this myself. I'll link a couple in the description of this video which you can kind of take a look at in your own time. You'll see that most of this just backs up with hard facts what many in the tech industry have been saying, but they're actually being fairly brutally honest, which is, I mean, 4A Games, which is more than what I could say for a lot of AAA developers. So yeah, anyway, without further ado, now Oles was actually asked, how did you assess what the consoles were capable of when they first got hold of the development kits? And he said, one example I can give is Metro Last Light on both previous consoles, that would be Xbox 360, PS3, has some heavy vectorized and hand-optimized texture generation tasks. One of those that takes 0.8 ms on a single PS3 SPU and around 1.2 ms on a single Xbox 360 hyperthread. Just to clarify, by the way, the Xbox 360 is a 3-core CPU, and each one of those cores can handle 2 threads each. So that's why he's saying hyperthread. In regards to the PS3's SPU, that would be the synergistic processing units on the PS3's cell processor. If you need more information regarding the PS3's cell processor or the Xbox 360's CPU, you can search on either this channel or on redgamingtech.com, redgamingtech.com, should I say, for PS3 post-mortem, and it goes into exactly how those CPUs work. Anyway, he then goes on to say, once we profiled it for the first time, already vectorized via AVX versus VEX on the PS4, it took more than 2 ms, which is basically twice the amount of time. This looks bad on a 16 ms frame, but the thing is, this task's sole purpose was to offload a few cycles from the older GPUs, which is counterproductive on current gen hardware, so this code path was just simply switched off. Now, in the case of vector tasks, generally speaking, these are highly numeric, and tasks such as compute and that type of thing are often offloaded to that. Now, with the advent of faster GPUs, specifically the more advanced compute units of the PS4 and Xbox One, it simply was not really required. So, just simply the different CPU architectures between the x86/64 nature of the PS4/X1, which of course are CISC, versus the RISC of the previous generation systems. Okay, so this one's going to probably begin upsetting a few people. So what about the Xbox One's lower compute count, memory bandwidth, and ES RAM? Some titles are even looking at 720p versus 1080. And what's your take on it? Oles said, well, you've kind of answered your own question. PS4 is just a bit more powerful. You forgot to mention the ROP count. It's important too. Slight aside, the PlayStation 4 has 32 ROPs versus 16 of the X1. And let's not forget, both the CPU and GPU shares bandwidth to DRAM on both consoles. I've seen a lot of cases while profiling X1 where the GPU could perform fast enough, but only when the CPU is basically idle. I've seen the other way round, where the CPU does perform expected, but only under idle GPU, even if the CPU is supposed to get priority to the memory access. That's why Microsoft's decision to boost the clocks just before launch was a sensible thing to do. Counting pixel output probably isn't the best way to measure the difference between them, though. There's plenty of other and more important factors that affect image quality besides the resolution. We may push 40% more pixels per frame on the PS4, but it's not 40% better as a result. Your own eyes can tell you that. Now, right there is a couple of very, very important parts. And this has been what I've been saying is a massive issue, particularly when we go into the next question, which I want to quickly go into first. What about the ESRAM? Actually, the real pain comes from the ESRAM is not the fact of the ESRAM itself, but the small amount of it. As for ESRAM performance, it's sufficient for the GPU you have in the Xbox One, that in maximum theoretical bandwidth, which is somewhat comparable to the PS4, but it can rarely be achieved, usually with a simultaneous read and write, like FP16 blending. That's float point 16 blending, by the way. But in practice, I've only seen a few cases where it becomes a limiting factor. Now, right there is a huge deal, because what it does is it tells you three things. The first is that the Xbox One's DDR3 just doesn't provide enough memory bandwidth for when the CPU and the GPU are both running, in certain cases anyway, at full speed, which is really not great. And that's why the ESRAM's there. Now, I've always said, and this is even before the console's released, I did an article about ESRAM and why it's an issue with the Xbox One. The problem isn't the ESRAM. It's not a big deal. Everyone's said, oh, you know, the ESRAM's really bad, and to be honest with you, if it was twice as large, so 64 megabytes, just for example, or preferably 128, which would be the size of, say, some of the Intel EDRAM, I don't think any of the developers would really find it a massive constraint. It would be large enough where you could easily put your render targets. It would be large enough where you could put in, say, compute data if you needed it, and, say, larger textures if that was required, particularly ones with a higher fidelity. It'd also be great for lighting, and dozens of other different tasks, whatever the developers need it for. Now, ESRAM is specific as far as I understand it, and from what Microsoft have said in their slides, I'm guessing it's true. It's pretty specifically just for the GPU, but the fact that it's only 32 megs means you run out really quickly. Particularly if you're dealing with a 1080p image, there are different rendering techniques. For example, you can use forward rendering, deferred rendering, blah blah blah, and that's all great, and it can save you memory, but even so, it gobbles it up really fast. And personally speaking, I think if Microsoft did want to go the DDR3/ESRAM route, fine. I would have just liked to have seen them put in a larger amount of memory. And that, I think, would have solved so many issues of the Xbox One. You would have still had the slower GPU, but I don't think so many developers would find that they were so constrained, even if it was just, for example, 64 megs. But, well, it is what it is. So instead, what you're getting is an issue where the DDR3 memory for the Xbox One is 68 gigabytes per second, but once again, that's theoretical peak. Just like the PlayStation 4's theoretical peak, which is 176, isn't necessarily what you're going to be finding in real life. 68 gigabytes per second, which is obviously far larger in terms of a memory pool, it's just a bit of a problem. Anyway, another major one, DX11 GNMX, I'm sorry, versus GNM. Just in case you're unfamiliar with the latter two, GNMX and GNM are the PS4's APIs. One of them, I believe it's GNMX if memory serves, is a little bit like a higher level API for the PS4. I have covered this on PlayStation 4 API. You can search for it on the channel if you need more information on how this actually works, what the PS4's API is and how it functions. And GNM is the lower level. I have done an analysis on those, as I mentioned, if you do need more information on that. But basically, how do they work, and what type of impact do they have on the CPU, the driver, and so on. So Oles says, let's put it this way, we've seen scenarios where a single CPU core was fully loaded by issuing draw calls on the Xbox One, and that's purely on a mono driver with several fast path calls utilized. Then the same scenario on the PS4, it was actually difficult to find those draw calls in the profile graph because they were almost using no time and barely visible as a result. In general, I don't get why they chose DirectX 11 as a starting point for the consoles. It's a console. Why care about some legacy stuff at all? On the PS4, most GPU commands are just a few D words written into the command buffer. Let's just say a few CPU cycles, clock cycles. On Xbox One, it would easily be 1,000,000 times slower because of all the bookkeeping on the API does, but Microsoft is not sleeping really. Each XDK has been released both before and after the Xbox One launch has brought faster and faster draw calls to the table. They added all sorts of features just to work around the limitations of the DX11 API model. They even made DX12/GNM style do-it-yourself API available, although we didn't ship with it on Redux due to time constraints. Now, if you need more information on some of this stuff, I have once again done an analysis on what Microsoft discussed in their Developer Day conference. So you can actually search on the channel for Microsoft Developer Day analysis, or you could also search on the website Developer Day. This is just in case I'm a chimp and forget to link some of the stuff, because I've got a really ridiculous schedule today. I've got to review a couple of games, but so sometimes my memory is just like a sieve. I'm doing so many things at once. But what you could see is that they do indeed have a low-level access added to their API, right? But that was not the case. And what I've been saying for a long time, and it's just been fairly obvious with the comments of developers, well, this wasn't always what they were. The APIs on the Xbox One were, I'm just going to go ahead and say, I'm probably going to get a couple of downvotes, but I don't really care, to be honest. It was awful. The API on the Xbox One, from what I've read, what I've discussed with people, it was just bad. But Microsoft turned it around for quite substantially, to be honest. In their credit, they must just have basically done it for time reasons. So what you had, these situations where the CPU was just a massive limiting factor, so they did crank up the clock speed for the Xbox One. And in fact, you remember before the Xbox One was shipped, they were discussing things with journalists, they were doing tweets and YouTube and interviews, and they were even on, I want to say, yeah, it was NeoGAF, it wasn't Reddit, it was NeoGAF, and they were actually discussing this, and they were, arguing with users that the clock speed increase on the CPU when they turned it from 1.6 to 1.75 was a huge deal. They said, yes, it's a massive performance boost. In fact, it was actually more, they said, than increasing the GPU's clock speed, which was from 800 to 853, just to clarify. We can probably guess the main reason for this was the fact that, quite simply put, most of the draw calls and stuff were just being limiting factor on the CPU. Basically, the CPU, the one core that was being used, it just couldn't issue the commands fast enough, right? So, in this respect, Microsoft did a really good thing. They have some DX12 functions now in the API, which is good. They've left it to be more user manageable. And by user, I don't mean you as the end user, I mean the developers, of course, so they can actually much better go in and optimize. DX12 is going to be really important for PCs, because frankly speaking, there are huge issues with DX11. But for consoles, it's actually infinitely worse because, well, quite frankly speaking, the CPUs are just not as fast, and you can't go ahead and put in a faster CPU or overclock your CPU or buy a better graphics card. It is what it is. So the developers kind of have to work around this. So allowing them to optimize and to actually utilize things as required is just paramount. Indeed, a little bit later on in the very interview, he actually adds that DX11 was and I quote, "I will keep track of everything for you," and DX12 now says it's your responsibility, so it could be a much thinner layer. Now, moving on, what about Xbox One and DX12? Is it going to be a massive deal? Like, are we going to see a situation where DX12 is going to really make a difference? OLED says, no, it's important. All the dependency tracking takes a huge slice of CPU power. And if we are talking about multi-threaded command buffer chunks generation, the DX11 model was essentially and I quote, flop, while DX12 should be the right one. Now, I'd like to point out something real quick. Out of his quote, by the way, just in case you're not too familiar with what a command buffer is. It's basically the CPU telling the GPU what to do. So in other words, it's just basically when he says multi-threaded command buffer, it's basically the multiple CPU cores working together to basically get ready to issue the commands to the GPU. Anyway, what about the Kinect reservation with the June XDK update? So they actually moved from 900 to 912p, which they say is very modest. What does OLED says? Well, the issue is slightly more complicated. It's not here. Take that 10% performance which we've stolen. Actually, it's a variable. Like sometimes you can use 15% more, sometimes 7% and so on. We could possibly have aimed for higher res, but we wanted to be 100% stable, VSync locked frame rate this time. That's not to say we could have done more with more time, and as per my earlier answer, the XDK and system software continues to improve every single month. I have to say that's quite interesting, the fact that it's actually variable. I would like to know a little bit more about that, but they didn't delve more into why and how that actually is happening, so it's a bit of a shame. Regarding PCs, this is the last thing I really want to touch on. What about coherent memory? Unified memory on a PC. Nvidia are announcing a unified setup for PC. We know AMD are pushing it quite heavily. With the advent of DDR4, we know that, well, there's extra memory available, extra memory bandwidth available, which is, frankly speaking, a massive deal right now. There's just not enough memory bandwidth available on DDR3 with a built-in with a decent built-in GPU. Not really talk about the the HD series from Intel, more like the Kavari series, like the higher-end Kavaris, maybe. Even then, what you'll find is that the memory bandwidth very dependent. And you can actually Google some tests, and you can see that the DDR3 speed that they pick, in other words, let's say you go with like the fastest kit versus say the slowest kit, like 1600 megahertz versus say like a 2000 megahertz kit, whatever. You'd see a massive difference sometimes in performance, simply because there's extra memory bandwidth available. So the DDR3 memory is a massive limitation. With DDR4 coming out, it's still not enough. It's still not as fast as say discrete, but we're getting to the point where, particularly for APUs, I wouldn't be surprised if say APUs and SOCs in the future, you have those do certain compute tasks while you have a discrete GPU maybe doing something else. And anyway, I'm kind of going off topic, but the biggest issue with this unified memory is memory coherence. Now that's a very interesting topic, and I'll tell you why. Because Naughty Dog have discussed this exact same thing, and you can actually search SINFO, that is SINFO, on this channel, or on redgamingtech.com, and you'll come up with that exact same bit of information. Naughty Dog have basically said it's actually quite expensive regarding memory coherence. So what this basically means here is that, well, I'll read it out. Even on consoles, we have a highly integrated SOCs, which are system on chips, and we have options to map memory addresses, ranges basically for CPU, for GPU, and for fully coherent. And after being fully coherent, it's not really useful as it wastes performance. As for traditional PC, going through some of the external bus just to snoop the caches, it will be really slow. That's kind of the problem right now. I mean, it's very well to say, okay, basically the issue is that a lot of the time parts of data get locked. So what you'll have is like the CPU and the GPU can't address exactly the same time, because then you're going to get inconsistent data. Because imagine I'm trying to work on a problem as you're trying to work on a problem. We're both like trying to do a piece of math. It doesn't really work. Let's say it's like a times table, like a 5 times table, and you know I'm starting on one end and you go to the other. It doesn't really work. So instead, typically what happens is you have like locks, and a piece of data will be locked to the CPU. Just for example, the CPU will set up the instruction, or it'll set up the data or whatever it needs to do, and then it will shift it to the GPU, and then the GPU will say, hey, okay, I'm calculating this now, and then it will unlock it and say to the CPU, okay, well, I'm done with this, and that can actually add some latency. So the problem with compute is that some tasks, when you're actually doing this, they can actually be kind of expensive on pure time. So it's like sometimes you have to figure, is it actually faster for me to shift this to compute, or is it just faster just to run it on the CPU? And that's kind of a bit of a problem, and something which obviously is going to take a bit of time for developers to get used to. Compute is still fairly early, to be totally honest. I mean, yes, it's been around for a while, but, well, for consoles, it's not super new. Technically speaking, the PS3 cell could do some compute work, or equivalent of compute work, but in terms of GPU computing, it's fairly new on consoles and hasn't really been explored super well. And now, of course, we've got compute going to become pretty standard next generation. Anyway, I think that's just about it. I did miss out quite a few questions, but a lot of this was stuff like, you know, Steam OS and what are they hoping to achieve for the next game and stuff like that, which I don't really think is what anyone really wanted my opinion on, to be frankly honest. So hopefully that's answered any questions you might have had, and maybe even some questions you didn't have until now. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys go. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.